How's it going, everybody? I know the lighting is a little bit less than stellar, but this was the best time that I had to record after making the first attempt this evening on the way home from work, and the second attempt on the way from where I picked up dinner home. So, welcome into this week's episode of Riding in Cars with Cards. Due to an overwhelming demand, or at least a much more conclusive poll than last week, we're going to be talking about blue-black Pteramander in Standard. And this is a deck that I'm really, really high on, and it's not because of, it's not because of what you'd think. It's not an aggressive deck at all. It's not a, it's not a tempo deck. It's not a dive down deck. I guess if you really, really wanted it to be, it could, but that's not the original intent, at least best I can tell by how it was constructed. So, the deck comes to us courtesy of Magic Online streamer, not Magic Arena streamer, but MTGO, the old one, the one that less people are playing these days. It comes to us courtesy of MTGO streamer VTCLA, who has been playing it basically since War of the Spark dropped, and designed it specifically to prey on creature decks. And I watched it on stream. I watched Mason play a little bit with it and talk to him a little bit about it. And I watched Jim Davis play it on stream as part of his decks that he was really excited about, or like 10 brews for War of the Spark Standard, something like that. And I was intrigued. And then I was looking for something to play in between bouts of Izzet Phoenix and Mono Red when I'm trying to like more aggressively climb the ladder, and just something to kind of poke around with to try out on Arena. And I just discovered I had most of the cards of the most recent list, and the things I was missing were not things I was strapped for wild cards on. So I just went ahead and pulled the trigger on it. That's how I'm testing the deck. I'm in the process of setting myself up to get the cards in paper. But the story behind that's something we'll have to cover, or something you will, by the time this is uploaded, you will have heard the story behind how I am getting these cards on the podcast. Podcast will go up Saturday. This is going up Sunday. So, anyway, blue-black Pteramander. The way this deck is designed, it is one of the more interesting kind of combinations of blue and black spells that I've seen in a very long time. Because while we're playing Pteramander, we're not playing it like any other deck in Standard that plays Pteramander. While we're playing God-Eternal Kefnet, we're not really playing it like a lot of the other decks in Standard do. While we're playing, Thought Erasure, removal spells, card draw, we're not really playing them like a lot of the other decks in Standard do. The best way I can describe this deck is it's like a tap-out control deck. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the best way I can describe it is through a history lesson going back to Zendikar Alara Standard, where counter spells in Standard were so bad that control decks just didn't play them. It wasn't that they were that like the format had become hostile to them like it did during RTR Standard, Innistrad RTR with Cavern of Souls. It wasn't anything like that. What happened during Zendikar Alara Standard is we just didn't have any good counter spells, quite frankly. And so when players were trying to come up with an answer to John, normally you would interact with cards like Siege Gang Commander, Garruk Wildspeaker, and Broodmate Dragon with counter spells. But we didn't have any good ones. Like, the closest approximation to a control deck we played was a budget deck that I helped Gavin Varhay work on. So, and it was just a weird whole other exercise in deck building that I'll have to cover in another episode. But that may be a direction we go in the future with this series, is looking at some historical decks and in the context of the formats they were in. But I digress. This deck plays a lot like the blue-white control decks during that era, because the counter spells were so bad they just didn't play them. They said the best way we can interact with what these other decks are doing is we can just steadily once we get to about 4 or 5 mana, just every single turn do something that neutralizes their previous turn. You are completely reactive. They do something, and then on your turn you respond. And then they do something else, and then on your turn you respond again. We're playing like a bunch of Day of Judgments, plus Martial Coups, plus Gideon, plus Jace by the time it was all said and done. Like, that deck was just... Trump. It's, you play a thing, I trump it. You trump my trump, I trump your trump that trumped my trump. And I've already used the word Trump more than a lot of people listening to this are going to be comfortable with. But I digress. You know, you're just, well, sirens at, what, 10 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere. This is awesome. For those wondering, I'm doing my laundry, drying my clothes right now. So I'm using the time I have while the clothes are drying to record this video. The way this deck is designed is similar to that. You are trying to figure out what your opponent's up to with cards like Thought Erasure, or just by patiently biding your time, making sure, you know, you don't fall too far behind. And then once you figure it out, like once you figure out what deck they're on, okay, it's an ambulance. Once you figure out what deck they're on, cut the strategy off at the knees. Just knock it out from under them. Every turn. Like, they do a thing and you trump it, and they do a thing and you beat it, and they do another thing and you do something better. That's the basic premise behind it. It's a call and answer. That's the best way I can describe it. As such, this Pteramander is not the same as Mono Blue Tempo's Pteramander. It's not the same as it Drake's Pteramander. Pteramander in this deck is a 2-mana 5/5 on like turn 6, turn 7. It's not a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that eventually becomes a 5/5 later. Sometimes you do cast it on turn 1, like in your mono red matchup, you just really want to make them burn a burn spell on it. You would rather them fire a burn spell off on that because you can eventually grind them out with other cards later. You know, the Pteramander is much, much less important in that matchup. But by and large, in your mid-range and control matchups, you want to treat Pteramander as a 2, 3, 4 mana 5/5. Like, that's what it's here for. Is to just be a big, stupid flying creature for not a ton of mana. You know, even if it's a 4 mana 5/5 flyer, that's still above the curve when it comes to raw mana efficiency, and that's what you're here for. The best analogy I can give is Jim Davis said he was trying to Pteramander was doing its best Tombstalker impression in this deck, and I couldn't agree more. That's the best comparison I've heard. Because it's a similar amount of mana. The difference being, the next Pteramander isn't made weaker by you having played the first. So, diving into the deck list, from the most recent one, courtesy of streamer VTCLA, which is the one that I used as the template when I built my arena list. There were a couple of card choices I had to change due to availability of wild cards. I didn't quite have enough rares to finish out my playset of Enter the God-Eternal, so I made a couple of worse changes, but that's what I had. And I will definitely be picking up Enter the God-Eternals once capable. But with the aggro decks, we'd been sorting the cards based on their mana cost and then worrying about non-creature spells. With this deck, we're going to worry about what the cards do, like what their function in the deck is. Because it's really important to understand that on the basis of the fact that, like, my response to the Twitter poll was, this deck is going to be fun to cover because it's like 60% flex slots. Which is to say, like, 60% of it, you can play whatever you want to in those slots. So, the original list calls the only threats, like, here is a creature that only generates value by sitting on the table and being a creature. Like, I have to untap with this card for it to matter. We have 4 Pteramander and 2 copies of God-Eternal Kefnet. That's it. And here's the thing. God-Eternal Kefnet is most of the cost of this deck. That's a big reason why I'm in. Is because 2 copies of God-Eternal Kefnet is the most expensive card in this deck. by like a lot, by several times compared to the next most expensive card. At least, you know, it's like it's Kefnet, Watery Grave, Drowned Catacomb, everything else. So, like, that's enough to get me interested, because if I only have to find 2 copies of one expensive card, I'm already interested in this thing on my terms, because I love saving money and having a deck that lets me compete. I'm already here for this. I love it. Kefnet, you know, Pteramander doesn't really need an introduction. Just, it's a little bit different the way you play it in this deck. So, again, instead of treating it like a 1-mana 1/1 that sometimes becomes a 5/5 later in the game, you treat it as a 2-mana 5/5 flyer later in the game. That's what you're steering toward. You're trying to steer the game toward a point where a cheap 5/5 flying creature kills them. That's what you're here for. If you can do it, you know, drop it for 1 mana and then bait their removal spells. Like, one of the most effective things I found is my opponent forgetting that you can stack multiple instances of adapt, even though only one of them will actually resolve and put counters on. So I get my Pteramander to the point where I can adapt it for 1 mana, and I'll just jam it on the board and leave the rest of my mana open, and they're like, Lava Coil. I'm like, adapt. And they're like, Shock and Response. I'm like, adapt again. You know, I guess that's a bad analogy because it still dies, but like, you know, if they go, you know, Fiery Cannonade and you adapt, and then they Shock and Response and you adapt in response again, like, it's not dying. And you just ate 2 of their cards for none of yours. That seems really good. You know, it's a little bit more flexible than an actual 2-mana 5/5 flyer, which is weird to say, but that's the world we live in with Pteramander. And in the case of God-Eternal Kefnet, the amount of value it provides in this deck is just obscene. So the list from VTCLA is playing 24 lands, a total of 9 creatures, and everything else is an instant or sorcery. Think about how likely that Kefnet is to hit. It's pretty daggum likely. It's gonna hit something. May not necessarily be what you want every time, but it's gonna be a thing. And value is value when you're in a deck like this, quite frankly. So moving from the threats into the next closest amalgamation to threats, our other creature is 3 copies of Augur of Bolas. And again, with 24 lands, 9 creatures, everything else is instant or sorceries. So 24 lands, 9 creatures, that's 33. And that leaves us 27 instants or sorceries. That's like the most likely Augur of Bolas has been to hit anything in a while. Like, it's more likely to hit in this deck than it is in Pauper. Even when the Pauper decks are playing 18 lands. That's ridiculous. And you can even, I would argue, get away with shaving a land or 2 in the future. 1, because of the London Mulligan, and 2, because of a suggestion I'm going to make here in a minute. But we'll see. I'm going to try it out. Don't take me at that right away. I have not gotten around to actually testing it yet. It's just something I'm going to run the numbers on and try it out. So Augur is the first step in the card selection portion of the deck. And it's important in the card selection, it's important to have a lot of card selection in this deck, because you really want to make sure you're finding the right cards for the right situation. That's one of the biggest problems with tap out control, is you want to be able to get exactly the correct answer as quickly as possible. You want to be able to sculpt the game state the way you want it. You want your hand to be good. You want the board state to be pretty simple, and then just be able to dominate it with a singularly powerful threat. That's the basis behind the archetype. And the other card selection tools we're going with here, like Augur's really good. It's really good against all these aggro decks right now, because it just blocks every single 2/1 creature ever. block that Viashino Pyromancer, block that Get to Lava Runner even with the +1/+0. Block that Dauntless Bodyguard, that Sky Marcher Aspirant, that 1/1 token from Legion's Landing. You just eat it. Force your opponent to pay 4 life for their Adanto Vanguard if you're in chump blocking mode. You know. And, I mean, not for nothing, but even when your white weenie opponent gets a really, really strong draw and just throws a bunch of stuff on the board, you can still just block the biggest thing while you dig for your out. And that's not nothing. The fact that it doubles as basically a life gain spell in your aggro matchups while also serving as a powerful source of card selection is really, really key for this deck. And then the other pieces of card selection, we have 4 copies of Opt, 4 copies of Chart a Course, and 1 lonely little Notion Rain. And this is where things can get a little bit dicey. Because I love playing decks with 4 Opt, 4 Chart a Course. But I really like those decks to be a lot more proactive than this one is. I like being able to reliably cast a Chart a Course with the raid trigger or make the discard matter a lot more than just adapting my Pteramander earlier. You know, I love Chart a Course in Is It Phoenix. I love Chart a Course in Is It Drakes. I like Chart a Course in the Is It Wizards deck that Andrew Cuneo was playing in the MPL and Henry Mildenstein from the Constructed Criticism family of listeners hit Mythic with this past month. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, Henry. I'm still working on pronunciations. Tennessee, what do you want from me? But, you know, I like it in decks that can really take advantage of it, and I don't know that this is one. But I do like that it's a 2-for-1, sometimes a 1-for-1, but it just digs you 2 cards deeper. But therein lies the rub. We're already playing Opt, and Opt is a little bit stronger against one of this deck's weakest foes, which is Narset Parter of Veils. Because, you know, Narset is a house against a lot of our card selection. Completely turns Chart a Course and Notion Rain into blank pieces of cardboard. We just cannot meaningfully cast those cards with a Narset on the board. We can cast them. They're just not going to do anything. Not anything we want. Chart a Course just reads discard a card, and Notion Rain reads Surveil 2. Neither of those things are things we want to pay that much mana for. So, one of the things I'm considering in that slot instead of Chart a Course is, what's it called? My brain just flaked on me. Shimmer of Possibility. It's a distinct possibility that I'm going to play Shimmer of Possibility in that slot. Shimmer of Possibility being 1 and a blue. It's from Ravnica Allegiance, I believe. Look at the top 4. Sorcery speed. It's an impulse. You look at your top 4, choose a card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. I believe it's in a random order instead of in any order, but 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Nobody cares about that part. Looking at 4 cards and taking 1. There's 2 reasons I like that in this deck. 1, we need to draw the right cards. We need to find the right cards. Digging 4 cards deep and picking the one we want is a lot more powerful than drawing 2 and discarding 1. Even if our goal is to make a big Pteramander, I would argue. And this is from having played the deck a fair amount on Arena and kind of running it by some of the local guys. And, letting them test it, letting them, see what they think. I like the idea of Shimmer in that slot. The other reason I like Shimmer in that slot is the Narset problem. We can cast an Opt under a Narset as long as we wait until our opponent's turn. We can't do that with a Chart a Course. We can, however, do that with a Shimmer Possibility because it does not draw anything. You look at 4, put 1 into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. That means it resolves meaningfully under a Narset, and you might even be able to find an out. That's not nothing. Sometimes one of the most valuable things to have in a card is to have it not be bad when other cards are. But I will say, try it out as intended. Try the original Opt, Chart, Notion Rain split before you do anything, because you may like that better than what I'm trying to do here. Try it out, see what you like. That's the beautiful thing about the card selection slot, and, well, basically every slot that I'm going to mention from here on. All of it's flexible. You can pretty well do what you want here. You may want to trim down on card selection. You may just want to trim a chart, trim the Notion Rain, and play something else there. Play a couple of counter spells. I don't know. That's up to you. And then for the Notion Rain, I would like to play something like a Chemist's Insight. A little bit more meaningful to hit with Kefnet. Both are going to cost 2 mana when they're revealed, but the Chemist's is a savings of 2 mana, where the Notion Rain's a savings of 1. And 1 copy of Chemist's is more valuable than 1 copy of Notion Rain. Even though they're both going to dig for the same amount of cards, Notion Rain's going to dig through 4 cards right now. Chemist's is going to give me 2 cards right now, and then later on, when I'm in top deck mode and need a little bit more gas, I can draw, pitch the land, Chemist's, maybe find some more. Just a little bit more valuable to me. And yes, it still falls under the Narset problem. I understand that. Probably just going to have to be that cross we have to bear here. Then we go into the Disruption suite. Disruption, normally in these types of decks, is reserved for counter magic and maybe a little bit of discard. In this deck, it is literally just 4 whopping copies of Thought Erasure. And I cannot begin to tell you how elated I was to be correct about this card in Ravnica, Guilds of Ravnica preview season. I was positive this card was going to be good. It took time, admittedly. But when I read the card the first time, I said, this is Castigate with upside, and Castigate was a staple during original Ravnica Standard. And it has proved its worth since we got the rest of the cards. Like, that card is just so good. It very frequently just takes the thing you can't deal with. And then you get knowledge of their hand so you can sculpt decisions going forward. Like, it's just so good. And then immediately after seeing your hand, you get to decide whether or not your top card's good. Sure. I'll do that for 2 mana, when previously the only upside I got for doing it for 2 mana was getting to exile the card in Castigate. That was your upside for doing it for a black and a white with Castigate. So doing basically the same thing in a lot of matchups. Although I guess admittedly Castigate would be a little stronger against Nullhide Ferox, because it doesn't discard it. Exiles it. Big brain play. Kidding, obviously. But the card's just really, really, really good. And in a format with 3 mana Teferi running rampant, being kind of the litmus test for what threats are good, having a card that just strips it out of their hand before it's a problem, I'm in for it. I'm here. And then the entire rest of this deck is removal. Like, I wish I was making that up. It's 3 Cast Down, 1 Tyrants Scorn, 1 Elder Spell, 2 Vraska's Contempt, 2 Cry of the Carnarium, and all 4 whopping copies of Enter the God-Eternals. I take it back. There's one other card. It falls into the same subcategory that Enter the God-Eternals lies in, which is your Haymaker cards. When you're playing a tap-out control deck, you want a card that is just an absolute beating to resolve against mid-range and aggro. Enter the God-Eternals is an absolute beating to resolve against mid-range and aggro. It just is. Kill your biggest thing, gain 4 life, make a 4/4. And the rest of the text on this card doesn't matter. Honest truth. I've milled myself. I've milled my opponents. I've tried both lines. It hasn't really made much of a difference. Yeah, sometimes it makes our Pteramander bigger, faster when we mill ourselves. It's okay. Not a big deal. Card's just good. It's just really, really, really good at beating up creatures. And then the last Haymaker is Command the Dreadhorde. Because when we're playing Thought Erasures and we're playing removal spells to kill creatures, and we're playing more Thought Erasures, and we're playing, you know, God-Eternal Kefnets and Pteramanders to pressure planeswalkers, and we're playing Vraska's Contempts to get the scary ones off the board, but we can let some of the smaller ones go. There's not a lot we want more than Command the Dreadhorde, and there's the singleton copy of the Elder Spell. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. The original VTCLA list is playing one in the main, one in the board of both Elder Spell and Command the Dreadhorde. I would assume probably specifically for the Command the Dreadhorde matchups. So that you can just, they do their thing, and then you kill all their planeswalkers, and then you take them. Like, that's the goal, right? And then, you know, 24 lands. You can play around with it. I've seen some lists include Blast Zone from other people who have tinkered around with it a little bit. I can get behind Blast Zone in this deck. The biggest thing I want to reference here, though, it's possible with this shell of playing Pteramander as functionally Tombstalker and playing God-Eternal Kefnet with a bunch of instants and sorceries for value. Counter Magic's pretty good. Even if you don't get to take full advantage of Kefnet flipping a instant or sorcery, that's fine. You know, flipping a counter spell. You can try to set your opt so that you can draw it during their turn and then be able to reveal a fresh card during yours. Like, obviously, Kefnet is more powerful when you were flipping a card that you can cast right away. I understand that. But if you can protect yourself from these cards that are just going to hammer you, that's pretty relevant too. So I can understand if you want to trim some of the removal down, trim a little bit of the card selection, and play some counter spells, maybe just like Spell Pierce and a Negate and Essence Scatter just to kind of cover your bases. I can get behind that. If you want to go further down the removal rabbit hole, if you want to go further down the disruption rabbit hole, you know, trim one of the enters and trim like a cast down in order to play a couple of copies of main deck Duress. I think that's totally defensible right now. Duress is really, really, really good when the format is like mono red, which is half instants and sorceries, and these non-creature driven decks like Command the Dreadhorde, like Jeskai Super Friends, like Esper Control. Like, main deck Duress is totally defensible right now. I don't know why it wouldn't be. Seems really good. So going forward, I think this deck is in an interesting spot. And it falls into the category that I really, really like as someone who plays this game on a very, very tight budget and on a limited amount of testing time. Which is to say, I can look at my list of a deck that I'm really comfortable playing and say, okay, what do I need to beat this weekend? What's everybody playing? Okay, well, I can change this card here. I can change this card here. Put in a couple of these. Take this one out. Put in a couple of these. Tinker with my sideboard to match up a little better here. And let's go. And I can just play the same deck. And it will have different answers every week. It will have different outs every week. It'll have different cards to play to. And it creates this fun little deck building puzzle every time you take it to an event, whether it's a local IQ, an MCQ, or whatever. You know, it gives you a fighting chance by virtue of the fact that you can tune it to target whatever it is you want to beat. And that's something that's really appealing to me. There's a lot of value to be had in decks like the other two we've done in this series so far, something like Rakdos or Gruul Aggro, where your deck is just going to do the same thing, game in, game out, every time you play it. And a lot of the time that's just good enough. Like, your opponent just doesn't have it, they can't deal with it, they don't draw well, they stumble on mana, whatever, and you just kick their teeth in. That's fine. But there's also a lot of value in your deck being able to adjust and adapt to what your opponents are doing. And just, take what in football terms, take what the defense is giving you. You can play small ball really well, and you don't have to try to go over the top of them. You don't have to try to outrun them. You can just keep chipping away little bits at a time, grind your way through. That's something that's really appealing to me, and it's something that I really look forward to getting to do more of. So that's going to wrap up the attack on Blue-Black Pteramander. I really, really like this deck. I'm definitely looking forward to playing more with it, both on Arena and once the cards can come in and I can get my legs under me, so to speak. Really look forward to playing with it in paper too. So, thanks again for watching. If you have questions, concerns, suggestions, you know where you can leave those? Right down there. Right down below. Either here on YouTube or on the post that this video is on in the Facebook group, or on the post that this video is on Twitter. Talk to me, people, especially when it comes to what you want to do with the sideboard for this deck. I'm going to leave the screenshot in the Facebook group and on Twitter down below of the original VTCLA list that I reference in this video. Again, all the credit to them for coming up with this archetype. It's really cool. I love it. Oh, man. What else? Next week. Oh, man. I guess I'm going to have to do this in a series of polls after I post this video. We're going to decide if we want a current format or if we want a historical example. And then based on the responses to that, do another poll to decide which deck. But this is going up on Sunday. We're going to begin the week riding in cars with cards, and we end the week with the Homeward Path. So I'll catch you Saturday on podcast. Check it out. And thanks again.